They laughed loud enough to rattle the glassware right there at the family reunion, and the smell of overcooked shrimp clung to the air. Name's Calder Royce, 56 boat repairman, gripping my silver pocket watch like it might anchor me. Ever had a moment when one small gesture turned an entire room on its head? I used to think family reunions smelled like forgiveness. In Norfolk that summer, they smelled like buttered shrimp bourbon and the kind of cologne that lingers when the wearer has moved on. 100 people give or take threaded between round tables and poster boards of black and white photographs, men on docks, women on porches, a century edited into smiles. Our company's sizzle reel looped on a screen at the front, cranes moving like metronomes, hulls cutting clean water. My grandfather's handshake paused at the top of the arc. When my face appeared, it didn't linger. If you blinked, you'd think I had never stood there at all. I kept to the margin, half hidden by a potted palm that had known better centuries. It gave me a sightline to the stage and enough leaves to pretend I was examining floral health instead of the family business. Evan drifted in and out of view, taller than I picture him when I'm not looking, tie a little crooked patience set to medium. He lifted a brow at me across the room. I gave him what I hoped read as, "I'm fine." Calder. Lowell came sideways with a glass and 2 cousins for ballast. His smile was polished. The edge below it was not. Word is you've become quite the artisan bilge pumps varnish educating the youth. Tell me, how does retirement feel at your age? The cousins laughed as if he were brave for asking. Courage is cheap with an audience. Busy, I said. Some problems don't care what you call your hours. Aunt Nella, who is kind in direct proportion to her distance from a microphone, patted my arm. It's good you keep your hands active, dear. Idle men get ideas. Ideas built those ships, I said softer than I felt it. Family built those ships, Lowell corrected. His glass knocked my sleeve in a gesture that wanted to be brotherly and landed short. Speech in 5. Try not to lurk in the ficus when the reel gets to the good parts. Palm, I said. He didn't ask for the difference. He floated toward the stage. The MC tapped the mic into obedience lights, warmed, and the room unclenched into expectation. I let my right hand settle in my jacket pocket, where the case waited cool familiar, the shallow notch along its rim fitting my thumb like it had been made for the habit. My grandfather's watch has lived long enough to collect evidence: a nick from a hatch, a scratch from a screwdriver I should not have held at 11, a hinge that clicks with the same crisp decision every time I open it. I wind it when I need reminding that time keeps its own counsel. It doesn't have to be kind to be constant. Lowell's voice filled the ballroom jokes, a shout-out to donors. A careful history that turned detours into scenic routes and accidents into learning opportunities. He spoke of legacy with that tone men use when they want it to sound like gravity. There were nods and murmurs. The cousins glanced back to see if I looked impressed. I examined the plant. Then the doors at the rear opened and the air changed the way it does before a thunderhead shows itself. Not louder, quieter, in a way that stacks the noise around it. 2 men entered first, not making a point of being first, and between them walked a compact figure in a dark suit that didn't try to be expensive. I recognized him before the room decided how to react. Some voices you remember with your bones. 2:11 a.m., ship stability. Can she swing 32 seconds at bearing 215 without sliding her load? He wasn't alone. A woman kept to his shoulder, face still, eyes counting, exits, windows, hands. The director didn't count. He looked, and the room rearranged itself into what he had already decided it was. He saw the stage everyone sees the man under the lights, and then his gaze moved like a beam across the floor until it found the far corner where the palm put fronds between me and consideration. It held there. People around me stopped mid-sentence the way you do when a narrative you like starts to wobble. He lifted his phone halfway to his mouth without looking away. "Ma'am?" he said into it, once the syllable thin and exact as a blade. Then he ended the call and changed the geometry of the night by not walking toward the dais. Lowell paused, one gesture hanging. The laugh he was building landed on the carpet and looked around for a home. The director crossed the room toward me, unhurried, as if crowds part for tide, not for men. He took my hand without ceremony. The shake belonged to a colleague on a clock firm and brief. "Mr. Royce," he said. His voice hadn't aged at all. "Director." My own voice remembered how to fit inside that calm. Behind him, his aide's gaze brushed my face. My hands the pocket where the watch warmed my palm, then moved on. Around us the murmurs rethreaded themselves into theories. Two cousins performed surprise like a play. Aunt Nella forgot her glass in mid-air. Evan had stopped at the edge of the knot of people expression, unreadable in a way that made me proud and uneasy at the same time. "Apologies," the director said with the ghost of a smile that doesn't ask to be believed. "Traffic." It was an explanation, and not one. He moved on. The carpet took him toward the front as if that had been the plan all along. Lowell restarted mid-sentence with a new sentence, which is a trick if you don't practice. He thanked the director for attending. He thanked the room for attention. He thanked time itself, I think, for arranging events to flatter him. Applause knew when to show up. Lowell materialized again, glass-refreshed smile re-lacquered. He took in the distance between me and the stage, the bar, the director, and tried to make a diagram out of it. "Didn't know you were networking." "I'm not," I said. He leaned in the way people do when they want to look like they're whispering wisdom. "Be careful who you remind of what. Some things belong behind glass. For the real." The word legacy didn't appear, but it hummed between us like a transformer. "Some things don't belong behind glass," I said. He looked for a comeback and found a donor. "Enjoy the shrimp," he said, and left me with the smell of bourbon and a neat line of certainty drawn across his back. The night kept moving. Toasts bred smaller toasts. The screen repeated my grandfather's handshake until my grandfather became a loop. My son laughed at something a second cousin said, and then remembered himself and looked over, and I gave him the nod that says I'm fine and means I'm surviving. When the program finally released us, the room sagged into relief. People found the doors in clusters, the way schools of fish decide all at once. I stood where the plant approved and let the tide pass. The director had already gone, or had never really been here, depending on how you tell that. The aide took one last sweep of the floor with her eyes, checked something off, and vanished without leaving a draft. Evan touched my elbow. "You coming?" "In a minute." I watched the staff break down the last of the trays, the way they move as if gravity is a colleague. On the screen the loop ran once more, paused on the handshake, and went to black. Outside the waterfront gave me diesel in the throat and salt in the lungs. Norfolk at night is a hum that doesn't apologize. I walked to the car by water out of habit. The harbor breathed. I matched it. A horn sounded far out where the channel turns long and patient like someone calling an old name. In the driver's seat, I let the door stay open to keep the smell of the bay inside. The jacket pocket warmed under my palm. I flipped the lid and watched the second hand carve its small circle steady, unsentimental, refusing to rush for anybody's speech. My thumb traced the old notch. My mind traced an older route phone calls at impossible hours, questions that measure steel and people with the same ruler, a ship's belly grumbling when she doesn't like what you've asked her to carry. Footsteps in the lot. Not for me. I closed the watch and the door and let the engine find its voice. Back at the marina, the docks gave their old creak, and the tarps breathed like tired lungs. Someone had left a coil of line in a hurry, and it lay there in a figure that meant nothing. I hung it properly because small order fights, big chaos, and you take the victories you can get. The office smelled like coffee that remembered the bean. I checked the ledger the way you pat your pockets for keys, reflex more than need. When I finally turned off the lights, the plank under my heel answered with the same complaint it has delivered for years. Out beyond the pilings, the bay kept its counsel. I slid my hand into my jacket one more time and felt the cool weight settle against my palm, grooved and certain as if the past were a thing you could hold without cutting yourself. Inside the watch, a spring refused to skip. Inside my chest, something that had been shrinking made room. The night had said enough. The room back at the hotel could keep its theories. I stood on my own boards, listened to the water, and let the tick find me in the quiet. By 9, the heat had already climbed into the wood. The docks gave off that sweet, tired smell of sun-warmed planks and salt that's been through this 1,000 times. I set a paper cup on the piling coffee gone the color of old pennies and whistled the kids in like they were a crew I'd drawn on a chalkboard. "Figure 8 on a bite," I said, dropping a length of line into Jay's hands. No heroics, no shortcuts. Jay rolled his eyes like he'd trained for it. He was 16, and all angles the kind of kid who pretends not to care so hard he almost convinces himself. Micah and Tori shuffled up with a toolbox between them as if it weighed more than it did. Somewhere above us a gull cackled, delighted with itself, and the sound bounced along the pilings like gossip. "Why's it called a bite?" Jay asked, fingers already making a figure 9. "Because someone with a dictionary named it," I said. "Try again?" He smirked. "Man loves his knots," he told Micah as if I were too far away to hear. "Knots love men who get them right," I said. "There's a difference." They snorted. The line rasped over calluses they're still earning. The rhythm of rope over skin is a small, satisfying sound like sanding a rough board until it remembers it was once a tree. I moved down the dock, nudging a fender here, straightening a cleat hitch there. The bay held its breath between tides. "Hey," Micah said, squinting out toward the channel. "Wasn't it around here? That one ship? The one that didn't make it back?" He snapped his fingers, trying to remember the name, the way you try to remember what you came into a room for. That cargo one." Maribel Jay's knot froze. Tori's eyes flicked to me. I kept my hands on the line, feeling the lay of it like a pulse. "There are always ships," I said. "Some go quiet. That doesn't mean they stop speaking." Micah nodded, not understanding already moving on. Jay yanked his knot tight and grimaced at his own mistake. He started again without being told. "That's the only real progress I trust." A scooter backfired in the lot. The gulls rose, scolded, settled. I sipped the coffee without thinking and made a face. It had cooled into something stubborn. Ruthie appeared at the top of the ramp like people do in movies, silhouetted a second, then real. She wears observation like jewelry, visible, unthreatening a warning if you know what you're looking for. "Morning, Mr. Royce," she said as if we'd already agreed on the day together. "Morning," I said. "We're tormenting rope." "Looks mutual," she said, eyes tracking Jay's hands without comment. She folded herself onto the cooler and took out a notebook she didn't open. Reporters understand that the first thing to write down is sometimes silence. Tori lifted the toolbox lid and inhaled like a mechanic in a bakery. "What's the plan after Knott's?" "Sand," I said. Groans. "Wood doesn't care about your feelings, only your attention." "Like algebra," Jay muttered. "Algebra never saved a hull," I said. He finished the bite, at last clean compact. I didn't praise him. I just gave him another length of line, the way the sea gives you another wave, not as a reward, but because there's always another. Ruthie waited until the rhythm settled, then let the first pebble drop. "You hear about the memorial for the Maribel?" she asked the air. "City Council's back-burnering it." Again. Micah glanced up. "That the one I said, the lost cargo ship cargo?" And then some, Ruthie said, and her tone made the gull's laughter feel rude. "Weigh the paperwork stacks. It's hard to tell what it was supposed to be carrying and what it actually carried. Happens. But this one, the gaps are tidy." "Tidy gaps," I said. The phrase tasted like clean hands after dirty work. She tilted her head. "You worked on her engines once upon a time." I shrugged. "I've worked on a lot of engines, and you remember them," she said, not as flattery, as fact. Her gaze slid off me and landed on the piling where my coffee-weighted ring of condensation marking time I hadn't noticed passing. She didn't look back. Harlan said to say hello. The rope in my hand went light, then heavy again. Harlan doesn't send hellos like messages. He sends them like coordinates, which Harlan J. said mostly to have words in the air. The Harlan who once convinced a stubborn diesel to run with 2 busted injectors and a prayer, I said. Jay grinned despite himself. "Sounds like cheating." "It's the opposite," I said. "It's listening." Ruthie finally opened the notebook not to write, but to tear out the corner of a page. She folded it twice and slid it across the cooler without looking like she'd done anything at all. I didn't take it. Not yet. The kids were watching like cats, pretending not to. "You got something on your mind?" Tori asked me, blunt in the way kids can be when they haven't learned how to put pillows around the truth. "Always," I said. "Today it's splinters." She snorted and reached for the sanding block palm, already finding the grip. The first strokes were timid, then the paper found its bite, and the sound changed less, scratch more hum. The wood's color warmed under her hand grain, waking. Ruthie let the work thicken the air before she spoke again. "Harlan remembers a room," she said. "Says you know which one. Says the keys will behave for you." Jay's head snapped up. "We breaking into something?" "No," I said. "We are sanding a dinghy." I let the sentence sit, then added, "And some doors open for manners, not for muscle." He smirked. "That a proverb?" "It's a budget line item," I said. Micah straightened from the gunwale, back popping like cheap timber. "You think they'll ever do that memorial?" he asked Ruthie. "For the Maribel?" "They will if enough people remember." "They promised," she said. "People don't remember promises," Jay said. "They remember videos." "Then we'll give them both," Ruthie said, and finally looked at me again. "Harlan's at the diner by the ferry after 11. He'll drink bad coffee until 12. He asked me to make sure the hello got delivered." "Consider it delivered," I said. "Consider it received," she offered. "Consider it heard," I said, which is not the same thing, but better than nothing. A breeze made a hand of itself and moved across the slips, raising little shivers in the water. The marina cat trotted past with a fish smell agenda. Somewhere a radio from a passing truck drifted an old song down the ramp, static, doing most of the singing. Tori leaned into the sanding. Micah found a rhythm on the other side. Jay's knots started to remember themselves without him. I picked up the folded corner Ruthie had left and slipped it into my shirt pocket without unfolding it. Paper makes a different sound when it's carrying a weight you can't see. My coffee had given up. I drank it anyway. The heat had gone out of it, but the bitterness stayed useful in its way. "You're quiet, Mr. Royce," Ruthie said. It wasn't a question. "I'm listening," I said. "To what? Boards, lines, gulls," I said. "And the part of the mind that speaks when your mouth is busy." She smiled like we'd agreed on something and closed the notebook she'd never used. "I'll see you after 11 then." "You won't," I said. "But I'll see him." She saluted with 2 fingers and walked off up the ramp steps unhurried, as if time were a thing that came to her. The kids kept working. The dinghy's gunnel turned from grey to a soft, forgiving brown. Sawdust dusted their forearms and made their freckles look like a pattern. Jay held up his latest knot and didn't ask for my opinion. I nodded anyway and handed him the next length of line. Again I said. He sighed. Then he smiled, surprised to find himself doing it. When their hour was up, I sent them toward the bait shack for sodas and a lecture on littering from the owner. I stayed. The docks were quieter without their shoes tapping out impatience, but the place didn't go silent. Marinas never do. They settle into a kind of breathing you hear if you stand still long enough. I unfolded the paper square. A name. A time. 1 word archives. I could feel how Harlan had said it like a man who knows which boards squeak and which don't. I looked out past the last row of slips where the harbor opens its mouth to the bay, and the bay pretends it's not thinking about the ocean. The channel markers winked their chores. Farther out, a cargo hull slid by like a neighborhood moving houses. Behind me, somewhere in the office, a file cabinet thunked as it settled in its frame metal, remembering what it holds. I slipped the paper back into my pocket and ran my thumb along a frayed line until the fibers lay down. There are rooms that keep stories in boxes and rooms that keep them in air. Some nights, if you listen, the boxes breathe. I stood there a while, letting the smell of diesel and salt and drying varnish stack themselves into something like a thought. Then I glanced toward the outer harbor, toward the big water, toward the past, shaped like a ledger, and felt the tug of a key I hadn't touched in years. The diner's windows held the afternoon like a picture frame harbor light slanting in gulls, making quick notations in the sky, steam lifting off the street after a brief apologetic rain. Wood paneling ran around the room at shoulder height, nicked and dark, where elbows had taught it patience. The jukebox hummed under the clatter of plates, offering a song only the booths could hear. Fried oysters worked their way through the air. The coffee worked faster. Harlan was already there, back to the wall in the corner booth that always seemed to save itself for him. He wore a sweater the color of old rope and a face that had seen more weather than the forecast admits. When he stood, it was only long enough to put his hand in mine. The skin was dry and warm, calloused where ropes and wrenches leave their small signatures. "You look like work," he said, settling again. I brought some with me, I said, sliding in across. The vinyl seat sighed as if it had been waiting to. We let the waitress pour coffee and name a special neither of us would order. Harlan stirred his with the slow care of a man disarming a habit. Sugar fell like snow into dark water. He didn't speak until the steam had curled twice and gone thin. "How's the marina?" he asked. "Still floats," I said. "Kids still swear sandpaper is a hate crime until it makes the wood confess." He smiled with one side of his mouth. "And the family story. Still on the screen," I said. "Edited for length and comfort." A truck downshifted somewhere outside. The window glass answered with a small, sympathetic tremor. Harlan watched the surface of his coffee steady, then reached under the table and brought out a thick, battered envelope that had known damp and corners. "Before we pretend we came here for the chowder," he said, "I want to put this between us." He slid a photograph free with the same care he'd just used on the sugar. Black and white matte, the kind of paper that leaves something on your fingertips. A deck slick and reflective, whether with seawater or worse the picture didn't say. Men stood in rain gear with their faces turned just enough that they wouldn't have to meet a lens later. In the lower right corner, a stamp with numbers I recognized as ours, not the Coast Guard's. "Maribel," I said. He nodded. "After." I let my eyes move in slow circles, the way you look at a bruise you already know the story of, but need to tell yourself again. In the left third of the frame, a coil of hose lay where no coil should. Along the bulkhead, a line of rivets flashed a different tone, newer or hurried, or both. On the far edge, just enough corner of a crate to be a question. "What were they moving?" I asked, though I had an answer I didn't like. "Depends who you ask," Harlan said. "And when?" The jukebox tried on a new key. A table of longshoremen laughed quiet and deep. The waitress orbited, topped me off, broke the surface tension of our silence with a clink. Harlan waited again, not for her to leave, but for the noise to call itself background. He produced a second item folded into something smaller than its consequences. Company letterhead. The watermark was one we'd paid too much for in a year. The books pretended we hadn't. The signature at the bottom steadied my hand without making it shake. "Lowell," I said. "And a friend," he said. "You know the hand that wrote the friend's name." The transfer memo was a thin bridge over a wide gap retirement fund to holding company to temporary operational expense. The date was too close to the sailing for coincidence and too far from the audit for comfort. I remembered the meeting that week. I remembered what we didn't say. Their defense, I asked. "Storms cost money," Harlan said. "So do lawyers. And a memorial if anyone's foolish enough to insist on one." He pushed the folded paper back toward me with 2 fingers, then stopped, keeping one calloused fingertip on the edge. "You know what I think about holes in hulls," he said. "You plug them. But there's a difference between a plug and a theft." I looked at his hands. They're what happens when a man never learns the wrong lesson. "You wouldn't have called me if you thought this was just a matter for a sermon," I said. He shook his head, the motion small enough to belong to a photograph. She didn't sit. The counter welcomed her like a recurring character. "She'll write what matters when it matters," Harlan said, following my glance. "And she'll wait when waiting is the work." I turned the memo so the signature faced me again. Lowell had learned our father's hand the way actors learn a part by wearing it until he could improvise. The pen had pressed harder on the first letter than the last. People give themselves away with pressure. Paper remembers. You could have brought this to a lawyer, I said. I will, he said. But a lawyer will ask me if the room still contains the thing the paper promises. I'd like to answer without having to guess. And you want me to do the looking? I want you to do the opening, he said. Looking is the easy part. Any fool can stare at a box. Knowing which box to ask and what tone to use, that's a trick you learned before you started pretending to teach children to sand. I don't pretend, I said. He smiled with the other side of his mouth. No, you teach. We let that sit. I tore a hush puppy in half. Steam escaped like a secret relieved to be told. I set the halves down and didn't eat. Harlan sipped his coffee, and if it wasn't good, he made peace with it quickly. You still carrying? He asked, nodding at my jacket pocket. The watch, I said. Always. He nodded in a way that made the booth feel older. Your grandfather used to wind that thing when he had to choose a word. Said it made time feel like a tool again instead of a tide. He wasn't wrong, I said, and rolled the crown under my thumb through cloth, feeling the spring answer like a muscle. Harlan leaned in, elbows careful on the table so the china wouldn't complain. Up close, the lines around his eyes were less like age and more like maps. The diner lights put a small shine on the edge of his smile. You have the hand Calder, he said. You always did. The sentence didn't arrive. It landed like something that had sailed a long way to find a pier. I let it stand between us, heavy and right. There are compliments that want to be framed and hung. There are others you slip into your pocket because you might need them before you get home. What time? I asked. After they change shifts, he said. The old guard leaves a little early on Fridays. The new one believes in being on time. He checked a wristwatch that had paid for itself in good advice. Tonight. Ruthie drifted over long enough to refill us herself. You two look like men auditioning to be careful, she said. We're rehearsing, Harlan said. She smiled almost kindly. Careful's a role that only ever runs one night, she said and returned to the counter. We paid because habit is a kind of luck. On the way out, we stopped under the door's little bell. The street had dried. Sunlight slid along the wet seams and made them honest. Across the road, the ferry took a slow bite of current. The wind off the water tasted like iron and something sweeter, maybe the bakery in the alley waking up its ovens for the dinner bread. Harlan put his hand on my shoulder, the way men do when they've been allowed to for longer than you've had your own opinions. Don't take a copy, he said. They'll notice missing before they notice moved. I know, I said. And when you bring me nothing, he added as if it were a bet he hoped to lose, bring me nothing you can swear about. I nodded. It wasn't a promise. It was an agreement with the kind of silence you make when you don't want to scare a shy animal out from under a deck. We split at the curb without performance. He turned toward the pier where the ferry put a shoulder into its task. I turned up the block toward the office whose windows only opened 6 inches because someone once fell asleep by one with a cigarette. The harbor light shifted to a cooler color, a longer angle. I moved down the first aisle, scanning for the right year, the right port code. Each box had a history written in black marker. Some letters slanting as if the person writing them had been in a hurry to forget. Maribel wasn't hard to find. She never had been. Her name had a way of floating to the surface. I pulled a box onto the nearest table, slid the lid back. Inside, voyage logs curled at the edges, manila folders that had drunk their share of damp air, and a stack of contracts that wore a sameness only forgery can produce. My hands knew the weight of truth. It's always just a little heavier. I leafed through a logbook whose entries grew neater in proportion to their dishonesty. Dates lined up too perfectly, signatures stopped trying after the second page. Near the bottom, I found the transfer records retirement fund entries folding into operational expenses amounts that could plug a hull and buy the sea to go with it. The sound came before the words, the slow, measured tread of shoes that belonged here less than I did. Lowell's voice followed calm the way glass is calm before it breaks. "Calder," he said, stepping into the edge of the light. "You could have asked." "I could have," I said, keeping my eyes on the folder. "But then you could have said no." He drifted closer, hands in his pockets, like a man admiring inventory. "We protect the company from bad weather, bad press, bad judgment. You taught me that. I taught you to keep the deck clean," I said, "not to sweep people over the side." His smile was small, like he'd found a coin he didn't trust. "You think you can carry those out and the world will thank you. You'll sink yourself, Calder." The watch fell before I knew I'd moved wrong. A small metallic ping on the concrete, a roll, then the stop that comes with damage. I bent and picked it up. A hairline crack ran from the 4 to the 9, splitting the face without obscuring the hands. I turned it over in my palm once, feeling the fresh imperfection under my thumb. Then I took the folder from the table. Lowell stepped aside without being told. The space between us was a formality, like the distance between two ships passing in fog. Outside, the air was cold enough to make the paper in my hand curl. I walked without looking back, the watch warm in my pocket, where my fingers closed around it. Back at the marina, the cabin light painted the table in soft amber. I laid out the documents one by one, the ink and dates and signatures telling a story I had already suspected. The crack in the watch caught the light, a thin, sharp truth you couldn't unsee once you'd found it. Somewhere outside, the tide turned. I listened to it move and knew the next steps would not wait for daylight. The cabin smelled of coffee and old varnish, a combination that had been aging together for as long as I'd owned the boat. The small brass lamp over the table cast a warm cone of light, catching the edges of paper and the faint swirl in the surface of my mug. Outside the open hatch, the marina muttered in its usual language, halyards tapping masts, water licking at pilings, gulls squabbling somewhere past the dark. Ruthie sat opposite me, sleeves pushed up, hair pulled back in a loose knot that kept slipping. Her pen clicked when she thought the rhythm syncopated with the ticking of the wall clock above her. Between us, the table was a quilt of contracts, voyage logs, and transfer records, each page anchored with a small weight so the night breeze wouldn't scatter our work. "This one," she said, sliding a page toward me. "The dates match the Maribel's last run, but the listed cargo is decorative stone from Manila. That's not even in their shipping route. Paper's only as honest as the hand that signs it," I said, scanning the numbers. The columns told one story, the margins another. The companionway creaked, and Harlan stepped down, the smell of the harbor clinging to his coat. He moved like a man who could still keep his balance in a storm without reaching for the rail. "You've got enough to light a match," he said, glancing at the table. "Now we make sure the wind's blowing the right way when you strike it." He laid a flash drive on the chart beside the coffee pot. "Crewman's statement. Recorded this morning. He's not a talker, but he knows the shape of the hole they cut in that ship." I plugged it into my laptop. A voice crackled through the tinny speakers, measured halting but certain. The man described the night the Maribel listed the crates loaded after official manifest hours, the orders that came from an office 2 states away. Ruthie listened without interrupting. When the recording ended, she reached for her notepad, writing only a time and a name. Harlan leaned over her shoulder to read it, then nodded. "We bring this to the gala," he said, "along with the files, the logs, the transfer sheets. But we don't walk it in like a manila bomb. We time it. Email with attachments sent while Lowell's on stage. Public press, and a few inboxes that still have spines. Insurance," Ruthie murmured. "In case someone pulls the plug," he finished. We worked the next hour in the steady light, assembling folders, scanning pages, naming files so plainly they'd make sense in a headline. I could feel the weight of the cracked watch in my pocket, the hairline fracture catching on the cloth each time I shifted. Halfway through setting the email scheduler, I heard footsteps on the dock. Evan appeared in the hatch, the air from outside still clinging to his jacket. He hesitated in the doorway, looking from Ruthie to me, then to the piles of paper. "What's all this?" he asked. "History," I said. "The kind people try to rewrite." He stepped in, drawn to a fund transfer document lying on top of a stack. His eyes moved over the figures, the names, the signature he'd seen before at holiday dinners. "This is Uncle Lowell's," he said. Not a question. "It is," I said. He stood for a long moment, then pulled out the chair beside me. "Tell me where to start." By the time the clock's minute hand reached the top, the files were sorted, the crewman's statement embedded in the email, the list of recipients double-checked. Harlan leaned over my shoulder as I clicked through the scheduler settings. 2,000 hours, he said. The cursor blinked, the confirmation box popped up. I pressed enter. The scheduler gave a soft click like a latch settling. No one spoke for a few seconds. Ruthie tapped her pen twice, set it down. Evan exhaled as if he'd been holding air for the last 10 minutes. I reached into my pocket and touched the watch. The cracked glass met my thumb, its edge faint but sharp enough to remind me that some things can't be put back the way they were. Outside, the tide shifted, and the boat moved just enough to make the rigging answer. In here, the plan was set. The night had already begun to count down. The chandeliers threw their light across 100 polished glasses, each catching it and sending it somewhere new. The air was thick with the blend of red wine-seared scallops and the faint metallic tang of silverware on china. I stood just inside the edge of the grand ballroom, letting the music from the band drift over me, a muted swing that kept conversation buoyant. Lowell was at the center of it all, framed by a polished mahogany podium and a screen waiting behind him. He looked comfortable there, shoulders square, chin up, the small smile of a man who believed he was the main act. His voice carried easily even without the microphone when he thanked the assembled for a century of honoring tradition and building the future. I could see Evan at one of the side tables watching him with a stiffness in his shoulders. Across the room, Ruthie caught my eye. She didn't smile, just tilted her head the way you do when you're ready to move a piece across the board. Harlan was in the shadowed corner near the utility panel, one hand resting casually against the wall, as if he belonged there. Lowell segued into a well-rehearsed story about the company's first cargo shipment hands, opening in a gesture meant to welcome. The first slide appeared behind him, a sepia photograph of the original crew. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Then the second slide came up. Not sepia, not polite. It was a still from the Maribel's deck, dated and time-stamped, showing the crates that never made it onto any manifest. A low murmur started near the back and moved forward like a change in tide. Lowell's voice hitched half a syllable before he pushed on. But the third slide landed harder, scanned contracts with his signature transfer logs rerouted from retirement funds. The murmurs thickened into sharp whispers. From my position, I saw the flick of his eyes toward the AV table, the small motion of his fingers to the tech there. The screen froze mid-frame as though an invisible hand had taken hold. That was when Harlan stepped away from the panel, his jacket shifting just enough for me to see the cable he'd switched. The projection jumped back to life, now rolling through every file, every page. Guests turned toward one another, heads bent hands covering mouths. The jazz stuttered, faltered, then stopped entirely. At the back of the room, 2 men in dark suits moved in with the precision of people who knew where they were supposed to stand. The CIA liaison's badge caught the light. The NCIS agents did not. Lowell's hands were still on the podium, but the knuckles had gone pale. The liaison stepped forward, his voice carrying without effort. "We'll take it from here." And then the CIA director himself appeared at my side as if the distance between us had been no more than a step. He took my hand in both of his, the warmth in his grip cutting through the cool air of the room. "Ma'am," he said quietly enough for just me. "We'll take it from here." I nodded once, feeling the cracked watch in my pocket shift with the movement. From across the room, Evan was still watching. But the look on his face had changed something open, almost fierce, that I hadn't seen in years. Pride plain and unguarded. The music hadn't started again, but the room was full of a different rhythm now, the shuffle of officials moving in the low hum of shock settling into place, the faint click of cameras somewhere near the door. I let the director keep my hand for another moment before stepping back into the current, knowing the tide had finally turned. The fog lay low over the marina, folding the world into pale silver and muffled sound. From the cabin, the faint gurgle of the percolator sent the smell of coffee curling out into the cool air. I sat on the bench by the dock rail, the cracked watch resting in my palm, its familiar weight pressing into my skin. My thumb traced the fracture line in the glass, the way it had since that night in the archive, as though by knowing every edge I could understand what had been lost. Footsteps came slow and certain, each one making the planks groan in the damp. Harlan emerged from the fog, like a figure drawn in with a soft pencil cap, pulled low, collar turned up. His hand was closed around something knuckles pale in the chill. "Morning," he said, lowering himself onto the bench beside me. Without preamble, he set his hand over mine. When he pulled back, the watch remained, but not as I had been holding it. The glass was whole again, polished to a soft gleam. The face caught the weak dawn light, hands steady ticking. I turned it over once, twice the smoothness, almost strange after so long tracing the break. Didn't think it could be fixed. "Glass breaks," he said. "Doesn't mean the works stop. Just takes the right hand to set it right." His gaze slid out to the water where the masts faded into mist. Same with people. Same with trust. We sat in quiet for a while, steam lifting from the mugs he'd brought, the faint clink when the spoons touched ceramic. The gulls were somewhere out past the harbor mouth, their calls softened by distance. Evan appeared along the dock jacket, zipped high hair still damp from a shower. He carried a sheaf of papers under one arm, but when he reached us, he set them down on the bench. "Got the schedule for the next training cycle," he said. "If you'll have me, I want to be here. Full time." Harlan's eyes flicked to mine, but he didn't speak. I nodded once, feeling the repaired watch against my vest as I clipped it to the small chain there. "You'll have your work cut out for you," I said. That's fine, Evan replied. Better than letting someone else tell our story. The three of us stayed there until the coffee was gone and the fog began to burn away, revealing the line of the far shore. The watch ticked at my side, steady, unbroken. A footstep on the dock that wasn't ours drew my eyes. Ruthie stood there, an envelope in her hand. She held it out without a word. The return address read Maritime Retirement Fund Office. I slid it open with my thumbnail. Inside a single-page formal letterhead, black ink, inviting me to partner in rebuilding the fund to oversee a program for the next generation of seafarers. The tide shifted under the dock, a subtle lift. I closed the letter, slipped it into my jacket, and let the sound of the water fill the space between us. The glass was whole. The works were running. And for the first time in a long while, the day ahead felt open. The timber beams of the new exhibit hall still carried the clean scent of pine, warmed by the spring sun streaming through the high windows. Outside, the water lapped gently against the pilings, carrying in the tang of salt and the faint chatter of gulls. Inside, rows of chairs faced a low stage, dressed with a blue cloth and a single wooden podium. Above it, on the wall, hung a framed photograph of the Maribel's crew faces, weathered and young, all at once frozen at the start of a voyage they couldn't have known would define so much. I stood off to the side, letting the hum of conversation wrap around me. Evan moved through the crowd with a natural ease, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, leaning down to talk with the younger trainees in the front row. Ruthie was by the display table pointing out the newspaper clippings she'd unearthed, the ink now fading, but the headlines still sharp. Harlan lingered near the door, his eyes scanning not from habit now, but from quiet satisfaction. When it was time, I stepped to the podium, the weight of the watch at my vest a steadying anchor. I spoke briefly about the sea, about the people who'd given their working years to it, about the promise of looking after our own. Then I called up the first scholarship recipients, their hands trembling a little as they accepted the envelopes. Their eyes held that mixture of awe and impatience I remembered in myself when the horizon felt impossibly wide. Outside on the dock we gathered for the launch. The youth crew had polished the small sailboat until it gleamed, the white of the hull almost too bright against the rippling blue water. Lines were coiled, neatly sails rigged and ready. With a cheer from this crowd, they pushed her off the breeze, catching and snapping the canvas as she moved. Evan stood beside me, the sunlight catching the edge of his grin. He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept his eyes on the boat. "Nice send-off, Captain." The word settled between us, light but solid. I let my fingers brush the smooth glass of the watch, feeling the steady tick beneath. Laughter rolled back from the dock, echoing off the water. Sails swelled, pulling the boat farther from shore. The crew's voices lifted over the slap of waves, each sound carrying something forward. As the bow cut toward the open bay, the horizon opened wide and bright. I stayed where I was watching, until the boat was a pale mark against the blue, the circle drawn all the way closed and ready to start again. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower over the bay, I felt the smooth, repaired glass of the watch warm against my palm. The sails from earlier were now just flecks of white on the horizon, moving steady and sure. Justice had its place, but what stayed with me was how mending the broken, whether glass trust or a life's purpose, can set more than one course right. Sometimes the storms aren't here to sink us, they're here to clear the way. If you've ever been handed a second chance in disguise, what did you do with it? I'd love to hear your story in the comments.